The wilderness was silent, except for the soft whispers of the wind and the distant rustling of leaves. But today, something else pierced that quiet, a child's cry. In the vast expanse of a wildlife reserve, one young boy found himself stranded alone, his cries filling the air. What could have led to this situation? And how would nature, a place of predators and prey, react when a fierce lion encountered this vulnerable child? It was early in the morning when Scout, a massive lion, stirred from his slumber. The sun was still low in the sky, and the air was cool, a perfect time for lions to be most active. His body, strong and muscular, stretched languidly as his eyes slowly flickered open. The world around him was his domain, a vast wildlife reserve, where the earth smelled rich with the scent of nature. Today was like any other. Scout needed to hunt. Being a solitary lion, it wasn't always easy to find food, but Scout had learned to manage. He had grown up here, surrounded by the vast open spaces, and though he wasn't part of any pride, he was one of the strongest and most respected lions in the reserve. He had fought many battles for territory, had fought fiercely to survive, and had learned from each one. But as he started to prepare himself for the day's hunt, something unexpected happened. A faint sound carried on the breeze, reaching Scout's keen ears. It was something that didn't belong in the tranquil morning, a cry. The sound was distinct, carried by desperation, and it tugged at Scout's instincts. A child's cry. Confused, Scout turned his large head in the direction of the sound. His sharp senses quickly honed in on the source, a small boy, no older than 3 years, sitting alone on the dirt road that passed through the reserve. His small body was trembling as he cried, his eyes swollen and red from the tears. The boy seemed lost and frightened, completely unaware of the dangerous surroundings that lay around him. Scout's immense size made him a formidable predator, but something in his instincts told him that this child was not prey. He circled the boy, his massive paws making a soft thud against the earth, his golden mane flowing in the early morning breeze. The lion moved cautiously, his eyes never leaving the child. He studied the boy from a distance, sensing something about the situation that he couldn't fully understand. Why was the child here? Where were his parents? As Scout continued to move around the boy, the child's cries grew louder, more desperate. The boy's voice echoed in the otherwise peaceful wilderness, and the lion's behavior began to shift. He stopped pacing and stared directly at the boy, his gaze intense. For a moment it was as though the world stood still, the only sound being the child's cries and the rhythmic thud of Scout's paws. Then, something changed in the air. A new scent carried through the breeze, something that made Scout's hackles rise. His instincts told him that there was danger approaching, and the lion's fierce protective nature kicked in. Without warning, Scout let out a deafening roar. The sound was so powerful that it seemed to shake the earth beneath him, sending a warning to anyone within earshot. The boy, startled and momentarily silenced by the roar, froze. His tear-filled eyes met Scout's. There was a brief moment of stillness between them, a moment where time seemed to stop, and the bond between predator and child was forged not in fear, but in a silent understanding. The boy didn't move, he was too scared to even speak. Scout's eyes narrowed, and his body tensed as he prepared for what was to come. In the heart of the wildlife reserve, Scout, the once abandoned cub, had now become a fierce protector. When a child was left alone in the road, it was not hunger, but an instinctive call to defend that drove him. But what would happen when the lion, a symbol of power and fear, chooses to shield the vulnerable? Would his actions be enough to change the life of the lost child and his future forever? The cry of the young boy, still piercing the quiet morning, echoed through the open savanna. The tears on the boy's face seemed to mirror the helplessness of the wilderness around him. No one had been there to care for him. No one had come to his aid. And as Scout, the lion with the deep, golden eyes, stared down at the child, he understood that his mission was not one of hunger or dominance, but of protection. Scout had been born into an unkind world. As a cub, he had witnessed his mother's tragic death. Poachers had ruthlessly taken her life, leaving Scout alone and helpless, unable to fend for himself. He had been found by Ethan, a young ranger at the wildlife reserve. Ethan had cared for the helpless cub, feeding him during the long nights and ensuring his survival. Scout's early days had been marked by loss and love, abandonment, and rescue. Ethan had always cared for Scout as his own, teaching him the ways of the wild, ensuring that the lion's natural instincts were sharpened but not forgotten. He had known that to survive as a lion in the reserve, Scout would have to be strong enough to survive the dangers of the wild, including the dominance of other male lions. But Ethan also knew that strength came with a price. Scout would have to eventually learn to live without human aid, to integrate into a pride of lions. And Scout had done just that. Over the years, he had become one of the most dominant males in the reserve. His battles for territory and pride had been fierce, but they had shaped him into the king he was today. His size was imposing, his stature regal. His golden mane was the envy of every lion in the reserve. But despite his imposing presence, Scout had never forgotten the bond he shared with the man who had saved him. As Ethan stood by the dirt road, watching the lion move cautiously around the boy, he understood that the bond Scout shared with him extended beyond the realm of the ranger's care. Scout had grown into a lion who, when faced with the prospect of protecting the vulnerable, instinctively rose to the challenge. The lion circled the child, keeping a respectful distance at first. The boy was sitting there in the middle of the road, bewildered, crying for someone, anyone to help him. His tiny body shuddered as each sob racked through him. Scout's sharp eyes never left him, but the lion did not move closer, not yet. It was as if he was trying to understand the situation. His keen senses had already detected the child's distress, and yet something else lingered in the air, a faint scent of danger. Suddenly, Scout stopped. His head snapped up, and his nostrils flared. His tail twitched in agitation. The lion's instincts had sharpened, and his hackles raised. There was something else on the horizon, a scent that spoke of aggression and rivalry. Scout could sense the presence of another lion, one who did not belong in this territory. In the vastness of the reserve, Scout knew that territory meant everything. A challenge from another male lion, especially one unfamiliar to him, could turn into a brutal fight. The other lion was not just any predator. He was an intruder, and his intentions were clear, he was ready to fight for dominance. But Scout wasn't going to allow this rival lion to threaten the child, not on his watch. The boy, still unaware of the looming danger, continued to cry. His cries had grown louder, more desperate. Scout let out a terrifying roar, the sound vibrating through the air and shaking the very earth beneath him. His roar was a warning, a challenge to any creature who dared approach the child. His teeth bared in a menacing display, and his eyes narrowed with fury. The boy stopped crying for a moment, stunned into silence by the roar. His tear-streaked face looked up at the lion in both fear and awe. It was clear that the child didn't fully understand what was happening, but he felt something in Scout's presence. He felt the weight of the lion's gaze, the power emanating from the great creature. And then, Scout did something that no one could have predicted. With a sudden burst of speed, Scout charged toward the boy, leaping over his head in a show of strength and grace. It all happened so quickly that the child barely had time to react. The lion's massive paws hit the ground with a thundering sound, and Scout's roar was deafening, reverberating off the distant hills. The boy turned to see what Scout was protecting him from, and that was when he saw it, the second lion, a male, stalking towards him, its eyes gleaming with a menacing intent. This wasn't a fight for food, it was a challenge for dominance. The second lion had made its move, and Scout wasn't going to let it get any closer to the child. A battle broke out between the two lions. Scout, with his size and experience, quickly overpowered the other lion. The intruder's claws swiped desperately at Scout, but it was no match for the larger, more experienced lion. Scout's enormous paws swiped through the air, striking the rival lion with such force that it was quickly pinned to the ground. The second lion tried to escape, but Scout's weight and strength were too much. With one final roar, Scout sent the other lion fleeing into the wilderness. Ethan, still in his jeep, had no idea that the lion he had raised would ever be in such a situation. As he approached the scene at full speed, his heart raced with panic. The sight of the two lions fighting just feet away from the child sent a wave of terror through him. Ethan's job as a ranger had taught him the dangers of the wild, but he never expected to witness such a dramatic rescue. Would Scout protect the child? Or would he see the boy as a threat? Ethan had no way of knowing. His only hope was that Scout's instincts would guide him. As Ethan approached, he slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the jeep. His eyes immediately locked onto the scene in front of him, Scout, standing tall over the small boy, his massive body poised protectively over the child. It was as if Scout was creating a shield around the boy, ensuring no harm would come to him. The boy, still shocked, looked up at the lion with wide eyes. But this time, there was no fear in his gaze, there was awe. The lion had saved him. Ethan watched, stunned, as Scout turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting the ranger's. The look in Scout's eyes was calm but focused, he was waiting for Ethan's next move. Scout had passed the test. Ethan had always known that Scout trusted him, but now the bond between them was even more profound. The lion had saved the boy not just because of Ethan, but because of his own instincts that in the heart of the wild, instinct drives a lion to protect a child in danger. Scout, the lion raised by Ethan, had already shown his extraordinary bond with his rescuer. But this moment, when Scout's fierce roar filled the air, protecting the abandoned child, was not only a display of power but one of deep, unspoken compassion. As Ethan tries to make sense of what just happened, the boy's past unfolds, leaving Ethan with more questions and an unexpected connection. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel, the engine idling as he stared at the unbelievable scene in front of him. His heart was racing. The boy, David, was safe for now, but Ethan knew this wasn't just about protecting the child from a lion, it was a deeper, more profound moment that would leave a mark on both of them for the rest of their lives. Scout, still standing tall and vigilant by the boy's side, turned his golden eyes to the ranger, as if waiting for instruction. But what could Ethan say? What could he possibly do to make sense of this incredible turn of events? The lion who had once been abandoned, now turned protector, stood as the boy's only guardian in the vast wilderness. Ethan slowly opened the door of the jeep, each movement deliberate. He knew better than anyone that Scout was unpredictable, his lion instincts were sharp, and he had witnessed Scout's raw power during countless moments of the lion's dominance on the reserve. But today, something different had taken place. Scout had not been driven by hunger, nor by the primal instinct to dominate another lion, he had acted solely out of protection, a fierce, unyielding desire to shield the child in front of him. As Ethan stepped cautiously out of the jeep, he watched the lion's every move. The last thing he wanted to do was make Scout feel threatened. Ethan had raised Scout since he was a cub, and the bond they shared was special. But today, there was no time to consider how it would play out. The child, David, needed to be taken out of harm's way. With one long, deliberate stretch, Scout turned and strolled away, his massive frame moving gracefully despite his size. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he watched the lion move. He knew that the trust between him and Scout ran deep, but to see the lion walk away from a moment like this was something Ethan could hardly comprehend. Was Scout leaving, or was he giving Ethan the chance to act? The moment Scout stepped back, Ethan acted quickly. His hands were steady as he moved toward the boy, taking a deep breath as he carefully approached. David, the young child, was still in shock but appeared calmer now that Scout was no longer looming over him. He had stopped crying, but his tear-streaked face and wide eyes told Ethan everything he needed to know. The boy was scared, confused, and in need of comfort. Ethan knelt beside him, his voice soft and reassuring. "Hey there, it's okay. I'm here to help you. Let's get you out of the road, all right?" The boy nodded hesitantly, his eyes flicking back and forth between the ranger and the lion. Ethan gently lifted David into his arms, cradling the child close. He felt the little boy's heartbeat against his chest, the trembling small body still shaken by the ordeal. As Ethan carried David back to the jeep, his mind raced. How had the boy ended up here, alone in the middle of the reserve? And what about Scout's actions? What had driven the lion to protect him in such a profound way? Was it simply a matter of instinct, or was there something more at play here? The jeep's engine roared to life again as Ethan slowly drove away from the scene. The vast, open land stretched out before them, the wildlife and trees appearing to fade into the background. Ethan couldn't help but think of the many nights he had spent tending to Scout, feeding him as a cub, caring for him, and watching him grow into the powerful lion he was now. But today, Ethan was witnessing something even more incredible. The lion had not just protected himself or his pride. He had protected a child, a complete stranger, someone who had no business being in the reserve in the first place. As they drove back to the ranger station, the weight of the situation began to sink in. Ethan needed to find out who this child was, where he had come from, and why he had been abandoned in such a dangerous place. But for now, the most pressing concern was getting David to safety, and Ethan hoped that the authorities could provide answers. Once they arrived at the ranger station, Ethan quickly made the necessary calls to report the incident. But as he did, he couldn't stop thinking about the boy's presence in the reserve. Why had someone left him there? And why had Scout chosen to protect him? There had to be a reason, and it was something that Ethan felt deep in his gut, a pull, a connection he couldn't explain. David, still in Ethan's arms, seemed to settle down a little as he ate some food that the ranger had prepared for him. The boy's small hands clutched the bowl, his eyes flicking nervously around the room. "Where's the lion?" David asked quietly, his voice barely audible. Ethan smiled gently, though his heart ached at the question. "He's safe, don't worry," he said, though the truth was, Scout was not the only one Ethan worried about. The boy was alone, and there were still too many questions that needed to be answered. Later that evening, as Ethan sat down to review the CCTV footage, his mind was clouded with worry. He watched the footage of the day unfold, the car pulling up near the reserve's boundary, the woman stepping out, and the child being abandoned on the road. The woman kissed the child on the forehead, a tender, loving gesture, but it was clear she had left him behind. What had driven her to make such a decision? And why had she chosen the reserve, a place where the boy was in clear danger? The footage was heartbreaking. Ethan watched as the woman disappeared into the distance, leaving the boy behind. The camera captured the little boy looking around frantically, searching for his parents. But they were long gone. The pain of abandonment was evident in the child's eyes, and Ethan couldn't help but wonder what had led to this moment. Despite the tragedy of the situation, there was a sense of peace in knowing that David had been protected, by the lion, by Scout, who had once been in a similar position of abandonment, but had found a family in Ethan. Now, Scout had protected David in a way that no one could have expected. The next few days were filled with questions and uncertainty. Ethan continued to care for David, feeding him, comforting him, and trying to piece together the boy's past. But there was only so much the child could share. His name was David, and that was all Ethan could get out of him. The authorities, after doing their best to locate the boy's family, eventually confirmed the worst: David's parents were nowhere to be found. No one knew where they had gone, or why they had left their child in such a dangerous place. Ethan struggled with the decision he had to make. He knew that placing David in an orphanage was the most logical course of action, but something about the boy's connection to the lion made him feel differently. It was as if fate had brought them together, just as it had brought Scout into his life years ago. Was it possible that Ethan could give David the same chance he had given Scout, a chance to be cared for, protected, and loved? It wasn't long before Ethan made his decision. The adoption process would be long, but he couldn't bear to send David to an orphanage. This child, just like Scout, needed love and stability. And Ethan, though inexperienced with children, knew that he could provide that for David. As the days went on, Ethan and David grew closer. The boy, though still scared and confused, began to trust the ranger. He even started to take an interest in the animals, especially the lions. Ethan took him on small excursions to see the pride, to see Scout, and to show him the world that had shaped both of their lives. Ethan couldn't help but see the parallels between his relationship with Scout and his developing bond with David. Both had been abandoned, both had found a protector in him. But as time passed, it became clear that Ethan wasn't just caring for David, he was building a family that had started with a lion and now included a child. And so, the next chapter in their lives began, one that Ethan could never have anticipated. As he watched David grow more comfortable, more secure, his heart swelled with pride. He had given this boy a chance, just as Scout had given him a chance to be his protector. It was a bond that could never be broken, and it was a bond that would define their futures in ways no one could predict. What does it mean to protect someone? For Ethan, it was more than a duty, it was a bond that transcended species. As he began to bond with David, the young boy he had taken in, it became clear that the act of protection had shaped not only Scout's life but now David's as well. But as the adoption process loomed ahead, Ethan faced an even greater challenge, one that would test his capacity to love and his ability to build a family where none seemed possible. Could the bond forged through unexpected circumstances become a lasting foundation for their future? The sun was setting on the reserve as Ethan sat outside the small ranger's cabin, watching the last rays of light dip behind the vast savanna. His hand rested lightly on the steering wheel of his Jeep, a reminder of the long day spent with David, the child who had entered his life unexpectedly. He felt the weight of the decision pressing on him, the decision to take on the responsibility of adopting David. It wasn't just about offering a safe place or providing food and shelter. It was about offering him a future, one that he could never have anticipated, one that would require all of Ethan's love and attention. The days had passed quickly, but in some ways, they had felt like years. Ethan had spent hours in conversation with social services, navigating the complex world of adoption. His life had never been about raising a family, his focus had always been the lions, the animals, and their preservation. Yet, in the face of David's fragile hope and trust, Ethan realized something profound. He was already part of a family, the one he had built with Scout, and now, David had become a piece of that puzzle. The decision to adopt was not an easy one. Ethan had no experience with children, no idea of what it meant to raise a little boy who had already experienced so much loss and trauma. But there was a bond that had formed between them, much like the bond he had with Scout. David, although young and frightened, had found comfort in Ethan's presence. He had found safety, not just in the secure walls of the reserve, but in the knowledge that someone would protect him. David had been through so much. His abandonment in the reserve, the confusion in his eyes when he had been left alone in such a dangerous place, haunted Ethan's thoughts. The loving kiss his mother had given him before disappearing, the quiet desperation that had caused her to leave him behind, still echoed in Ethan's mind. What had driven her to such a drastic decision? The answer was unclear, but Ethan understood one thing for certain: David had been left alone. Abandoned, just like Scout had been years ago. Ethan couldn't help but draw comparisons between his bond with the lion and the one he had begun to form with David. Both had been abandoned, both had found protection in him. But the difference was that with David, Ethan had the chance to provide more than just safety. He had the chance to provide a family, a future, and the promise of love, a promise that Scout had once been given and that now he could extend to the boy. As Ethan looked over at the small figure of David playing near the cabin, he couldn't help but smile. The boy was full of life despite the hardships he had endured. He was different from the frightened child Ethan had found just days ago, his eyes now shining with curiosity and wonder. It wasn't just about providing food and shelter, it was about giving David something more. It was about offering him a chance to be loved and to belong. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of Scout's roar in the distance. The lion was nearby, patrolling his territory as he always did. Ethan had grown accustomed to the lion's presence, the sound of his mighty roar echoing through the reserve. But today, it felt different. Today, it felt like the lion's roar was a reminder of the connection they shared, of the protection they both offered, and the family they had created together. Over the next few weeks, Ethan took every step necessary to ensure that David felt welcome in his life. He continued with the adoption process, filling out the necessary paperwork and working with social services to make sure everything was in place. Despite his lack of experience with children, Ethan took it upon himself to teach David about the animals, about the lions, and about the beauty of the wild. It was a world that David had never known, and in many ways, it was a world that was far safer than the one he had left behind. One evening, as Ethan took David to see the lion cubs, he saw a sense of wonder in the boy's eyes. It was the first time David had smiled since arriving at the reserve, and the sight of his joy was a balm to Ethan's heart. The cubs, playful and energetic, tumbled around in the grass, and David couldn't help but laugh. The sound was like music to Ethan's ears, a sign that the child was healing. "You like them?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle. David nodded enthusiastically, his small hands pressed against the Jeep window as he watched the cubs. "I want to play with them," he exclaimed, his face lighting up with excitement. Ethan smiled, glad to see the spark of life returning to the boy. It wasn't just the lion cubs that had captured his attention, it was the sense of security he had begun to find in this place. The same sense of security that Scout had found all those years ago, when Ethan had taken him in and offered him a second chance at life. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan's bond with David continued to grow. The adoption process was long and full of paperwork, but Ethan was determined. He couldn't let the boy slip through his fingers. He couldn't bear to see him placed in an orphanage, lost in a system that might not understand his needs. He had already lost too much, his parents, his sense of belonging, and now Ethan was the only family he had. One evening, as the sun began to set over the reserve, Ethan took David out to the edge of the savannah. The wind was cool, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink. Ethan had promised David that they would go to see Scout, and the boy had been eagerly awaiting the moment. They parked the Jeep and stepped out into the open, the vast landscape stretching out before them. David's small hand gripped Ethan's as they made their way toward the lion's territory. Ethan felt a sense of pride as he looked down at the boy. David, who had once been abandoned and alone, was now part of his family, a family that had been built from the unlikeliest of circumstances. As they approached the area where Scout often roamed, Ethan saw the lion's silhouette in the distance. The massive creature was lying in the tall grass, watching them with his golden eyes. Ethan had always been amazed at how aware Scout was of his surroundings. The lion had an almost human-like intelligence, and in moments like these, it was clear that he understood the bond they shared. When they reached the lion, Scout stood up and walked over to them, his massive form moving with grace. David's eyes widened in awe as the lion approached, but Ethan could see that the boy wasn't scared. Instead, he was fascinated, just as Ethan had been when he was first introduced to the lion. "Is he your friend?" David asked, his voice full of wonder. Ethan nodded. "Yes, he is. Scout has been my friend for a long time." David smiled, reaching out a tentative hand toward the lion. Ethan held his breath, watching as Scout sniffed the boy's hand before rubbing his head against it in an affectionate gesture. It was as if Scout recognized the boy as part of their family. It was a moment of connection, of understanding, and of shared history. For Ethan, it was a sign that everything was falling into place. The family he had built with Scout, the connection they shared, was now extending to David. The bond between them was unbreakable, forged not just through rescue and survival, but through the shared experience of love and protection. As they stood there, watching the sunset over the savannah, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. He had come a long way from the day he had rescued Scout from the wild, and now, he was watching that same lion protect a child who had once been abandoned, but who now had a family. A family that was unlike any other, but one that was bound by love, protection, and a shared commitment to survival. Sometimes, family isn't born from blood, it's created through actions, love, and moments of connection that transcend time and circumstance. As Ethan's journey of adopting David comes to an end, the final steps are just as transformative as the beginning. But as the bond between the young boy, the lion, and the ranger continues to grow, the realization sets in that family is not just about who you are related to. It's about the protection, sacrifice, and love you give to one another, and for Ethan, it's more than just a dream come true. It's his new reality. Ethan woke up to the same sounds he had grown used to over the past few months, the rustling of the wind through the grass, the distant roars of lions, and the subtle chirping of birds that signaled the start of a new day on the reserve. His eyes opened slowly, still heavy with sleep, but his heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. There had been something profoundly satisfying about knowing that, for the first time, he was not facing this life alone. David, the boy he had rescued and taken in, had brought an undeniable sense of completeness to his life. The empty house that had once echoed with silence was now filled with laughter and love. Over the last several months, David had become a part of the reserve. He was no longer the scared, abandoned child Ethan had found on the road that fateful day. He was now a boy who had found joy in the animals, a boy who had formed a bond with the lions, and, more importantly, a boy who had found a family in Ethan. Their bond was undeniable. Even Scout, the lion who had once been a symbol of Ethan's past, had become an essential part of their small but powerful family. Ethan's thoughts wandered to the long road of adoption that he had navigated with determination. The months spent working with social services, the conversations with lawyers, and the numerous paperwork required to legally become David's guardian had been daunting. But none of it mattered now. He had David, and that was all that mattered. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting golden light over the savannah. Ethan sat up in bed and stretched, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders but also the lightness of a fulfilled heart. He had a family now. He had someone to share his life with, someone who would walk beside him through the ups and downs of the future. David was already awake when Ethan entered the kitchen. The boy was sitting at the table, eating his breakfast, and watching a video on Ethan's phone. His small face lit up when he saw the ranger enter, and he stood up to greet him with an exuberant smile. "Good morning, Papa," David said, his voice full of excitement. Ethan smiled back, his heart swelling with love. "Good morning, David," he said, using the word "Papa" for the first time. It was a word that felt strange at first, but now, it felt right. He was David's father, in every sense of the word. The two sat together and ate their breakfast, talking about the plans for the day. Ethan had promised David that they would go to the lion's den, the place where Scout roamed freely, and show him the cubs again. David was always eager to see the young lions, who had a playfulness that reminded him of his own joy. But today was different. Today, they had something special to celebrate. Ethan had received the official adoption papers just the day before. After months of paperwork and waiting, David was finally his, legally, emotionally, and completely. The thought of it still made Ethan's chest swell with pride. He had made it. He had given this child a future. And in return, the boy had given him a sense of purpose he had never known. As they finished breakfast, Ethan put down his fork and looked at David. The boy was still full of energy, eager for the day ahead, but there was something in his eyes that made Ethan pause. It was the same look of wonder that David had when he first arrived at the reserve, the look of a child who had been given the chance to experience something magical, something beyond what he could have ever imagined. "You ready to go see Scout?" Ethan asked, knowing the answer before David could speak. David's eyes sparkled. "Yes, Papa. I want to see the lions." Ethan laughed and grabbed his keys. "Let's go, then." They climbed into the jeep and headed out toward the savannah. The road was bumpy, and the landscape stretched out endlessly, but for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt at peace. He was doing what he loved, working with animals, and he was doing it with his family by his side. It wasn't just about Scout anymore. It was about the family they had formed, the life they had built. As they reached the area where the lions often gathered, Ethan slowed the jeep, keeping his eyes peeled for signs of movement. The grass was tall here, and the lions often blended into the landscape, but Ethan knew where to look. He had spent years tracking them, observing their behavior, and understanding their patterns. Scout, as usual, was somewhere nearby. It wasn't long before they spotted the large lion lounging near a tree, his massive body stretched out in the shade. Scout's mane, thick and flowing in the wind, seemed to shimmer under the sunlight. Ethan parked the jeep and got out, taking David's hand as they made their way toward the lion. David's small hand gripped his tightly, but Ethan didn't mind. It was a reminder of how far they had come. The child had gone from being abandoned and alone on that road to being a part of something bigger, a family that loved and cared for him. The bond between Ethan, Scout, and David was unspoken but undeniable. As they approached Scout, the lion raised his head and let out a low rumble, his golden eyes fixed on them. There was no aggression in the lion's gaze, just recognition. Scout had been a part of Ethan's life for years, and he had protected David when it had mattered most. Now, the lion seemed to acknowledge the new bond that had formed between them. David looked up at Ethan. "Papa, does he remember me?" Ethan nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "He does. He's always been protective of you." David's eyes widened, and he took a cautious step forward, his gaze fixed on the lion. Scout remained still, his massive form like a sentinel guarding them. There was a quiet understanding between the two. The lion knew his place in the family, and so did David. After a moment, Scout stood up and walked toward the boy, his massive paws making little sound as he moved. David took a step back, but Ethan gently encouraged him to stay. "It's okay. He won't hurt you." Scout stopped in front of David, his massive body towering over the boy, but there was no sign of aggression. Instead, the lion lowered his head, nuzzling the boy gently with his nose. David laughed, his initial fear vanishing as he reached out to touch Scout's mane. Ethan watched the exchange with a sense of awe. In a way, this moment symbolized everything they had been through together. The bond between a man, a lion, and a child wasn't one of mere survival, it was a bond of love, protection, and trust. Scout had protected David without hesitation, just as he had once protected Ethan all those years ago. Ethan placed his hand on David's shoulder, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. "You're part of this family now," he whispered, the words more meaningful than they had ever been. "And so is Scout." As they stood there together, watching Scout and the lions in the distance, Ethan realized that he had found something far more precious than just a family. He had found a purpose. And he had found love, in all its forms, love between a father and a son, between a man and a lion, and between a boy and the world around him. The journey had been long, but it had led him to a place where family wasn't just about blood, it was about connection, protection, and the unbreakable bond that had been forged through years of struggle, survival, and love.